In the summer of 1943, the eastern plains of Russia shimmered under a rising sun that promised both glory and death. Dust hung in the air, heavy and dry, clinging to uniforms, to tanks, to the hopes of men who had seen too much war already. Operation Barbarossa had failed. Stalingrad had fallen. And now Hitler's eyes turned once more to the east, to a bulge in the Soviet line near the city of Kursk. It was here that Germany would try one last time to seize initiative on the Eastern Front. The plan was grand in design, as always. Two pincers would strike, Army Group Center from the north, Army Group South from the south, encircling the Soviet forces within the salient. For this, the Germans assembled their greatest armored force yet, 3,000 tanks, hundreds of Tiger and Panther models gleaming in the morning light, engines rumbling like thunder before a storm. The new Panthers, untested in battle, rolled forward with crews proud but uncertain. Beside them, veteran Panzer IVs bore the scars of years of war. Above them, the Luftwaffe waited for skies to clear, wings glinting silver. Across the lines, the Soviets were not blind. The Red Army had learned from blood. They knew the Germans were coming. Weeks before the assault, Soviet workers and soldiers dug in, miles of trenches, barbed wire, minefields stretching across the steppe. Thousands of artillery pieces were placed in layers, tanks buried to the turrets in the earth, ready to ambush. The Kursk salient had become a fortress. On July 4th, the eve of the attack, German soldiers sat beside their steel beasts under the pale moonlight. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and nervous anticipation. Some wrote letters home, words that would never be read. Others cleaned their weapons in silence. In the distance, Soviet flares cut the sky, and the rumble of artillery far away reminded them that the enemy was watching. At dawn, on July 5th, the world erupted. German artillery opened fire across a 200-mile front, the ground shaking like an earthquake. Shells screamed overhead, tearing into Soviet positions. Panzer divisions surged forward, engines roaring, steel tracks crushing the grass. Dust clouds rose as the first waves advanced toward the minefields, the air filled with the metallic scent of burning oil. Then came the Soviet reply. Hundreds of guns, hidden and silent until now, answered with fury. Explosions tore through the German lines, tanks vanishing in bursts of fire and soil. Smoke and dust turned the morning into a haze of confusion. From the north, General Model's Ninth Army pushed toward Ponyri, the little Stalingrad of Kursk, where every trench, every farmstead would become a fortress. In the south, General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army rolled toward Prokhorovka, their Tiger tanks clawing through the defenses. Through binoculars, commanders watched their dreams collide with the grim reality of Soviet preparation. Mines blew off tank tracks, flamethrowers turned bunkers into infernos, radios crackled with chaos. The once fluid blitzkrieg had slowed into grinding attrition. Yet the Germans pushed on, relentless, methodical, their discipline unbroken. By nightfall, the fields of Kursk burned. Thousands of men lay scattered between craters and wreckage. The heat of July mixed with the stench of fuel and blood. The offensive had begun, but no one yet knew they were standing at the edge of the largest land battle in history. As the stars rose over the steppe, engines cooled and soldiers tried to sleep amid the echoes of artillery. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Red Army waited in silence, stronger, deeper, and ready for the storm that was only beginning to break. The second day of July, 1943, dawned with the earth already scorched and blackened. Over the plains near Belgorod and Orel, the air shimmered with heat and smoke. Dust hung so thick that the sun seemed dimmed, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from what was happening below. Engines rumbled to life again before sunrise. German crews climbed into their tanks, sweat dripping down their faces even before the day began. Inside the steel hulls, it was suffocating. The smell of oil and metal mingled with the sharp tang of fear. In the southern sector, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army moved forward with grim precision. Tiger tanks led the assault, their thick armor shrugging off shells that would have torn apart lighter vehicles. Each gunshot echoed across the open steppe like thunderclaps. The Tiger's 88mm cannons roared, turning Soviet bunkers and anti-tank guns into torn shreds of metal. But the Soviets did not break. They fired back in endless waves, their own artillery hidden behind ridges, their T-34s darting through the smoke like predators. The ground shook continuously, not from single explosions, but from a constant drumbeat of bombardment. German infantry advanced behind their tanks, crawling through barbed wire and shell holes, faces pressed into the dirt as machine guns tore through the air above them. Minefields claimed men and machines alike. Engineers worked under fire, clearing paths for the panzers while bullets whined past. Overhead, the Luftwaffe and the Red Air Force clashed in swirling dogfights, the sky streaked with contrails and smoke trails from burning aircraft spiraling to the ground. By July 7th, the battlefront resembled something from a nightmare. Fields once green were now endless wastelands of craters, twisted wrecks, and fire. The German advance slowed, not for lack of courage, but from sheer resistance. Every hill and ditch hid Soviet guns. Every farmhouse was a fortress. Still, the German command pressed on, believing that one more push could pierce the line, one more thrust could win the day. At Ponary, the northern thrust under General Model ground to a halt. The Soviets called it Little Stalingrad. Fighting raged street by street, trench by trench, with men bayoneting each other in the mud. The smell of cordite and death filled the air. Flames rose from shattered houses, painting the horizon orange even at night. German flamethrowers sent pillars of fire roaring into bunkers, but new Soviet troops kept coming. Far to the south, near the small town of Prokhorovka, the greatest concentration of armored power ever assembled was forming. Hoth's panzer divisions had clawed their way through multiple defensive belts. Now, as the German spearhead neared its objective, the Soviets prepared to strike back with everything they had. Marshal Rokossovsky and General Rotmistrov gathered more than 800 tanks, most of them T-34s, for a counterattack that would crash headlong into the German assault. By July 10th, the entire front was alive with fire. Night was no longer dark. The sky glowed red from burning oil and phosphorus shells. Crews worked tirelessly to repair damaged tanks under the cover of darkness. Wounded men lay in shell holes, whispering prayers or calling for water, their voices lost in the constant thunder of artillery. The Germans had broken through several layers of defense, but their advance was faltering. Supply lines stretched thin, fuel convoys targeted by Soviet aircraft. Every kilometer gained came at the price of dozens of tanks and hundreds of men. Yet still, they advanced, driven by orders, by pride, and by the desperate hope that victory might still be possible. Then came the morning of July 12th. As the sun rose over the plains near Prokhorovka, German commanders peered through binoculars at a distant line of dust on the horizon. At first, it seemed like smoke. Then the rumble reached their ears. The ground itself began to tremble. It was not thunder. It was engines, hundreds of them. The Soviet counterattack had begun. From the mist and smoke, an entire armored army appeared. Wave after wave of T-34s charging forward, their turrets flashing, their engines roaring like a storm. German gunners scrambled into position. Orders shouted through radios vanished under the roar of engines. The largest tank battle in history was about to erupt, and the world would never see its like again. The morning of July 12, 1943, arrived with a sound that could be felt through the ground, a deep growing vibration that shook dust from helmets and made the air itself seem alive. Across the open fields near Prokhorovka, two steel armies were rushing toward each other at full speed. It was not strategy now, not maneuver. It was collision. Pure, mechanical violence. The sun rose behind the smoke, casting long shadows over a plain that was about to become a furnace. The German 2nd SS Panzer Corps, battle-hardened, confident, and equipped with Tiger tanks, advanced toward the village of Prokhorovka. Their mission was to break through the last Soviet defense line. Ahead of them, unseen in the morning haze, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army under General Rotmistrov waited. 800 T-34s and T-70s hidden in the rolling fields, engines idling, crews tense, faces pale in the dawn light. Then the signal came. The Soviet tanks roared to life all at once, the ground shaking under their tracks. They charged downhill at full speed, guns blazing, the noise a rolling thunder that drowned even the sound of artillery. Soviet tank commanders stood half-exposed from turrets, waving red flags, shouting orders that vanished in the wind. Dust rose in blinding clouds as steel met steel, the horizon vanishing in a storm of fire and smoke. From the German lines, gunners locked onto their targets. The Tigers fired first. Their 88mm shells tore through the charging formations, sending Soviet tanks bursting into flames, turrets flying high into the air. But the Russians did not stop. They came on in waves, closing the distance until the battle was fought at point-blank range, 50 meters, sometimes less. Tanks rammed each other, tracks grinding, metal screaming. Machine guns hammered from every direction. Flames danced across the fields as fuel tanks ignited. Inside the German lines, confusion reigned. Dust and smoke obscured friend from foe. Radio channels overloaded with static and screams. Crews fired blind, their vision slits filled with swirling chaos. T-34s appeared out of nowhere through the haze, firing as they came, some ramming straight into Tigers to jam their turrets or set off mines. Men fought with pistols, grenades, and even bare hands when tanks collided and hatches flew open. The air above was no quieter. Soviet IL-2 Sturmovik swooped low, unleashing rockets and cannon fire, while German Focke-Wulfs dived to intercept, the sky alive with tracers and explosions. The plain below became a sea of fire and moving shadows. Flames consumed both sides alike. A single Tiger tank, engulfed in smoke, continued to fire until ammunition ran out. A T-34, its gun disabled, rammed another German tank and exploded in a burst of light and dust. By midday, the temperature on the steppe exceeded 40 degrees. The smell of fuel and burning metal hung thick in the air. Ammunition cooked off inside wrecks, sending secondary explosions across the battlefield. Medics tried to reach the wounded, but were driven back by artillery. The grass, dry and brittle, caught fire. Whole sections of the field burned like a funeral pyre. By evening, the thunder had begun to fade. The Soviets had thrown everything they had into the assault: men, machines, courage beyond reason. The German SS panzer divisions had held their ground, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds of tanks from both sides lay twisted and blackened, their guns pointing at the sky like the bones of giants. Between them, the bodies of crews, German and Soviet alike, lay in grotesque stillness, the flies already gathering. The battlefield was silent except for the distant rumble of retreating tanks and the crackle of fire. It was not victory for anyone. It was annihilation. Reports that night painted confusion. The Germans believed they had won. They had destroyed more Soviet tanks. The Soviets believed they had held the line. The Germans had failed to break through. Both were right. Both were wrong. But as night fell, one truth was clear. The Wehrmacht had reached its limit. What had once been unstoppable, the iron spearhead of the German army, was now blunted. Kursk had become a grinder of men and machines, swallowing everything the Reich could throw at it. On July 13th, as Hitler sat in his headquarters hundreds of miles away, word arrived that the Allies had landed in Sicily. A new front had opened. Orders went out. The offensive at Kursk was to be halted. The dream of victory on the Eastern Front was over. The soldiers on the ground did not yet know. They only saw the fires burning across the horizon and the endless columns of smoke rising into the red dusk. The steppe of Kursk had become a graveyard of steel. The smoke from Prokhorovka hung over the plains for days, heavy and unmoving, a shroud over a battlefield of twisted steel and shattered men. The roar of engines had faded to silence, broken only by the distant rumble of retreating convoys and the hiss of burning fuel. The largest tank battle in history was over, but the war on the Eastern Front was not. For the German army, the dream of a decisive victory had died on the fields of Kursk. On July the 13th, 1943, Hitler issued the order. The offensive, Operation Citadel, was to be stopped. At his headquarters in Rastenburg, reports from Sicily told of a new Allied invasion. The Führer's grand vision of crushing the Soviet Union had collided with reality. To continue the attack meant risking everything. To halt it meant accepting defeat. For the soldiers still fighting near Kursk, it was neither victory nor retreat, only exhaustion and disbelief. In the days that followed, the once proud panzer divisions began to pull back, their columns winding through smoke-choked valleys and fields littered with the ruins of their own advance. Tigers and panthers that had survived the inferno creaked under the weight of dust and damage. Mechanics worked through the nights to keep them running, welding armor plates, patching holes, scavenging parts from the dead. The men were silent now. There were no speeches, no songs, only the hum of engines and the far-off thunder of Soviet artillery growing louder each day. For the Red Army, the time for defense had ended. With the Germans halted and bleeding, Stalin gave the order to strike. Across the front, the Soviet counteroffensive began with a ferocity that seemed to echo all the suffering of the past 2 years. Artillery rolled forward in endless rows, their shells lighting the horizon red. The earth shook as thousands of guns opened fire. Soviet infantry surged behind the barrage, their cries lost in the storm. The Germans fought desperately, holding line after line, trading ground for time. But their reserves were gone, their air support stretched thin. The Luftwaffe, once master of the skies, was overwhelmed. Soviet fighters ruled above the battlefield, and every German withdrawal came under fire from the air. Bridges collapsed, convoys burned, and once disciplined units dissolved into chaos. By late July, the momentum had shifted completely. The Soviets retook Orel in the north, Belgorod in the south, and by August they had reached Kharkov once more. The front that Germany had tried to break had turned into a tide that now rolled westward, relentless and unstoppable. For the first time since 1941, the Red Army was advancing on all fronts. In the ruins left behind, the full scale of Kursk's devastation came into view. The steppe was littered with the carcasses of more than 6,000 tanks, thousands of guns, and tens of thousands of dead. The smell of oil, metal, and death clung to the land for weeks. Burned-out wrecks stretched as far as the eye could see, their gun barrels twisted by heat, their tracks buried in the blackened soil. Soldiers scavenged what they could, food, water, boots, anything to survive. Those who had fought there would never forget. For German tank crews, Kursk marked the moment when the war changed, when hope turned to endurance and endurance turned to survival. Letters written home spoke not of victory, but of fatigue, of endless fighting, of fear that the road back to Germany was now longer than ever imagined. In the aftermath, the propaganda from Berlin tried to hide the truth. Reports spoke of limited objectives achieved, of successful withdrawals. But the men on the ground knew better. They had seen the face of modern war, a war of machines and mathematics, where courage alone could no longer decide the outcome. For the Soviets, Kursk was the turning point they had prayed for since the dark winter of 1941. The Red Army had not only survived, it had defeated the Wehrmacht on open ground. From this moment onward, the Germans would never again mount a major offensive in the east. The long retreat to Berlin had begun. As summer turned to autumn, the fields around Kursk began to grow quiet. Wildflowers sprouted among the wrecks. The wind whispered through the twisted barrels of tanks, and the rain washed away the blood. But beneath the soil, thousands still lay where they fell, German and Soviet, enemies once, equals now in death. The Battle of Kursk was more than just the clash of two armies. It was the death of Blitzkrieg, the end of the German dream of dominance. In its place came the slow, grinding reality of defeat. When the sun set over the Russian steppe that final evening, its light glinted off the wreckage of tanks and helmets half buried in mud. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the stillness of exhaustion of a war that had consumed everything. And somewhere, in the fading echoes of engines and the drifting smoke, the ghosts of Kursk still lingered, reminders of a day when steel met steel and the earth itself trembled beneath the weight of history.